let's get right to session 6, lightning talks, novel threat assessment for individuals, organizations, and their events. Gina kind of teed this up for you, so I'd like you to hear more from them, but we have a great panel for you today. So you remember Sam Hunter, IO psychologist, okay? We also have Amber Seaward, by the way, soon to be Dr. Seaward, who is wrapping up her Ph.D. at University College London. And then we go to protecting events in under-resourced areas with Nguyen. So he is an IO psychologist at UNO. And then we remember Kearns, Erin Kearns, criminologist UNO. So we end with Kearns. So I'm going to let them talk, and then we'll get to the Q&A. And please, again, this is your opportunity to ask them anything. So think of good questions. Sam, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Erin. To mic check, we're good? All right, thumbs up. Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. Love Gina's opening comments. She's always so good at summarizing and seeing the themes, and she did not disappoint. Before I jump into the project, I wanted to thank all of the folks on the team that engage in some of the work that I'm going to present. Was driven by several of them who were primary authors on this work. So I don't know if Kelsey's here. Kelsey, are you here? She's not. She may be watching online. So Kelsey Segala helped write the paper I'm going to share today. Dr. Parsons is also here. And Dr. Rechin, who just defended her dissertation, is now Dr. Rechin. She's watching online as well. I also want to thank Ajmal for all of the support on this work. And with that, I'll get into it. So a bit of background on what I'll be chatting about today. About a year and a half ago, folks at DHS reached out and said, can we do a state of the science summary on the tools that exist for soft targets? So soft targets come in a variety of forms, protecting a mall versus a museum versus a park. And so there are a number of tools that exist. CISA has a bunch, FBI has a bunch. So we wanted to know, was there some commonalities among those? Did you have to adjust or tweak scales to have them work across different environments? So that was the impetus for the work. A lot of psychometric stuff, reliability, validity, and the team has a nice deliverable that we can share and will be sort of formally available at the end of the summer. But if you want it now, we can share you an early version of it. But you can't put a bunch of social scientists in a room and have them look at psychometrics and tools and not have this question come up, which is, but what about the people that are involved? And so that actually prompted us to dig a little bit beyond just the psychometrics of these tools that exist, but sort of understand what it also means in a security context about protecting soft targets, how the folks involved actually have to use and engage with these tools. And so this led us to write a paper that's just been published at Safety Science. You're more than welcome to take a look at it. I can certainly send it, but you can find it available online as well. Before I jump into what we found in that paper and what the sort of general takeaways were, I'm going to share a story and embarrass my 13-year-old daughter, who's not here, so never bring this story up to her if you ever meet her, Miss Celia. We just got back from London, and as you know, on an international trip, you go through a range of security checkpoints, getting bags scanned and looked at in a host of ways. On the way back, with the very last bit of security that we were going through, one of the personnel at the airport pulled her bag aside and said, "Whose bag is this?" And she said, "It's mine." And she's a 13-year-old, so she's mortified about everything, much less being called out by a TSA agent. And he said, "Is there anything sharp in this bag?" And she said, "No, of course not." And he said, "Well, did you pack this bag?" And she said, "Yes, I did." And, "Are you sure there's nothing sharp in there?" "Yes, I'm sure." My wife and I are looking at each other thinking, excuse me, what's going on with this bag? And all of a sudden he reaches in and pulls out a giant set of scissors, and we thought it was like Mary Poppins' bag, like he pulled it magically out of nowhere. And she's like, I don't know where that came from. And eventually we found out, and this tells you a little bit about my daughter, that she packed scissors to cut the tags off of her souvenirs on the trip. So it tells you a little bit about what she was expecting on a trip to London. But she forgot about it. She was mortified. The TSA agent was great. He was stern in the beginning because he was looking at this dangerous thing, and then he saw a 13-year-old that was very scared and was very sweet and kind. We all got back and sat down and sort of recovered from this thing, and you've got this crying, teenager. And then this sort of question mark popped across all three of our heads at the same time, which was, why didn't somebody notice this earlier? In other words, we went through 6 different security checkpoints. Why was it the very last one? And let's just say, for the sake of the story, that the equipment was all the same, so we did see a lot of the same lighthouse equipment. The variable that was different were the people. And so those folks have different motivations on that day. They have different training. They are dealing with different crises of the moment. And so what this project is highlighting is just how important the individuals, the humans are, that are utilizing these tools, that are making these decisions, because we can have all the most amazing pieces of equipment, but the folks that are actually making these decisions have a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes with them as well. And so this prompted us to think about how do you build a culture around physical security, and there isn't much literature out there. There's a good amount of literature on sort of broader safety culture. That's actually a pretty big literature base. There's some on information security culture, but not really anything on building a culture supporting protecting physical security. And it matters when folks are good at building a culture, in other words, the beliefs and values and attitudes, what's really valued in an organization. When that is in place, we all know this, you work in organizations that have variability, and hopefully they're high on something like this. But when you have a good culture in place, folks are smarter about things, they have the right set of skills, and they're motivated to do a good job. When all those things are in place, they make better decisions, which results in less violence and acts that we're concerned about. And so building a culture, excuse me, is both really challenging, but also exceptionally critical. I wanted to just be a little nerdy here for a minute as an academic and talk about some of the things that help go into building a culture. So getting the right people in place is certainly important. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the individual differences and personality traits that can help build a culture, as well as some of the things that you can leverage as organizational leaders as well. So this just came about through the literature, and it sort of highlights the nuanced and complex nature of what it means to get the right people into an organization with regard to building a culture like that. So from the literature, we see things like personality traits that are really important. Conscientiousness is one. For my IO folks, we know that conscientiousness is a sort of universally good thing. When folks are dedicated and detail-oriented, this is good for most jobs, but it's particularly good for security jobs. Agreeableness is a funny one, and I use it to highlight the nonlinear nature, the curvilinear nature, or just we'll call it the nuanced nature of some of these relationships. So we take somebody that's highly agreeable, they like to keep the peace, they like to get along with everyone, they're great for certain jobs. Folks that are really low on agreeableness often engage in conflict, they can often be very skeptical. And so when it comes to finding the right mix of this for folks in a security landscape or in a security environment, you're looking for something that's not too low and not too high. Somebody that is too high might not be willing to pull that 13-year-old out and take a look at those scissors in a bag. Somebody that is too low on a trait like that might pull everyone out of the line to have a conflict with them. And so you're looking for someone that's more in the middle. So sort of showing and highlighting the nuance of what it takes to bring in the right folks and personnel. We also find in the literature that things like experience really matter. So when folks have actually experienced a security breach, they tend to be much better at having motivation and paying attention and being diligent. And then folks with experience, such as law enforcement or military, are also quite good in building a security culture as well. So those are just some of the findings that I thought were interesting. Also, 2 more slides, and so penultimate slide here. I've been studying climate and culture for about 25 years, thinking about it in a variety of contexts. These are some lessons learned that are both from the literature as well as the applied work that I've done with a range of organizations. So how do you build a culture? What are some of the things that you have as levers that you can pull? For many of the folks in the room, these are intuitive, if not, of course, Sam. But maybe it's a good reminder if we're looking to build or change culture, some of the things that we have at our disposal. The first one is leaders. Leaders mean everything. Not only are leaders directive, however, folks are paying attention to how you operate as a leader. Being a role model is huge. The things that you engage in send a message of what's acceptable and what's appropriate. And again, I think we intuitively know that, but it's an important reminder that, if being on time is something that's important to you, but you don't come in on time, that sends a very powerful message. And so how you operate as a role model is critical, as folks are very much paying attention to those things. The policies and procedures that you have are also really important. So having handbooks, we created one for NCITE because we know that's important. But you also want those handbooks to be accessible, and if they just get filed away and never talked about, they're also not much use. So they have to be both accessible, and you have to have at least a conversation about them on a regular basis. What's rewarded and what's recognized also sends a powerful message. Here at NCITE, we have a board that we sign for things that we're incredibly proud of. We don't just sign things for successes, we also sign things for good attempts. So what you reward sends a powerful message as well. Those things also trickle down into a performance appraisal system and a management system as well. If you're only talking about those things every year, you're not doing a particularly good job, so that has to be on a regular basis. Peer influences are incredibly powerful. If you have bad apples in the organization that are trying to do things in a way that you don't want them to, that can spread very quickly, so making sure that you're able to remove some of those folks if you can. Resources are critical as well. We're all fighting for resources, but we know that they're ultimately necessary. If folks aren't, they're overworked or working too many shifts, it's tough to get things done as well. And top management support matters. We have Sarah Myers here. You met all of our university support. That sends a really important message of how we are as an organization, and that's how you get good people in as well. And so with that, I'll just offer one quick comment. I know I'm just a little over time, but this project highlights something I just want to drive a point home, which is the interdisciplinary nature of the work. So we've got criminologists and we've got IO psychologists on the team. This project doesn't come about unless we have that mix of folks, and so I'm incredibly proud of the unique and novel nature of the work that they did. With that, I'll turn it over to Amber.
Testing. Is that working? Great. Hello, I am Amber. I'm a Ph.D. researcher from University College London, and I'm going to be talking today about a systematic review that I've done with Paul Gill and Zoe Marchman about the structure and operations of targeted violence threat assessment models. Quick disclaimer before I start. I've been having a bit of a language barrier or maybe accent barrier problem this week. When I've been introducing myself, a lot of people seem to think I'm named ABBA, like the Swedish pop supergroup. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying for the next 10 minutes. So threat assessment is an emerging field. It was initially developed by the US Secret Service to prevent assassinations, but it's since been applied to a wide range of settings which each have specific contexts and requirements. As Gina said, the behavioral threat assessment and management landscape really is a mess. There's a wide range of different ways that it's been implemented, and we don't know what works. Like other prevention methods, we want to know what works, where, in what contexts, under what conditions. And the first step to this is actually understanding what has been implemented in practice in order to compare between them to understand effectiveness. So to that end, we conducted a systematic review of case study literature, looking at the structure and operations of threat assessment teams of all targeted violence forms and across the world, using a variety of search strategies, but I won't bore you with the details of those. We had 48 included studies describing 27 different threat assessment teams. In terms of their targeted offense type, this was schools, higher education, workplaces, fixated threats and threats to public figures, violent extremism, and then a category of mixed threats and problem behaviors. In terms of the region of these teams, as you can see there, it's overwhelmingly in the US, with some in Europe and Australia as well. So we analyzed these and compared between them on 6 broad analysis categories. The first being the threat assessment setup. So this is the basic information of the team, the location, the targeted offense type, funding, remit, origins of development, key objectives, any other involvements that they do other than threat assessment. Next is the team structure. So this is the key members of the team, what disciplines are involved, whether there's a lead discipline that's in charge, how cases are processed and structured through that team, what training there is, and whether this has had any evaluation. Referral systems, so how cases are brought into the team, including whether there's any contact with referring bodies and training of referring bodies as well in what to report. Threat assessment process, so everything that happens from the point of referral to the point of case closure. What disciplines are involved when information is gathered, when assessments are done, what resources are used, whether this is all done in person or remotely, what risk assessment tools are used, and the final outputs of the process as well. Next is interventions, so either in-house or outsourced interventions, and case management and monitoring structures. And finally, and most importantly, quality assurance mechanisms. And this was data collection and record-keeping practices, data sharing practices, and importantly, performance evaluations. Spoiler for later, there are very few performance evaluations. So there were some key common themes we identified that unite a lot of these models. One is the origins of development. So the typical story of how one of these threat assessment teams starts is there's a high-profile mass casualty incident which sparks convening of a panel of stakeholders and experts and reviewing existing literature. They are also often united in their objectives. A lot of them explicitly mention that they operate according to the public health approach, and by that I mean there is an underlying problem facing an individual, often an unmet mental health need that's been insufficiently treated by mainstream services, and this is manifesting in problematic behaviors or threats of violence. And if you can use a multi-agency approach to resolve that underlying issue, you can improve outcomes both for that individual and for any public that are at risk of the threat. Oops, sorry, I haven't finished there. Team structure. Almost all teams are multidisciplinary, and this is definitely regarded as best practice. They all include at least law enforcement and mental health representation. There are some specialist units, so for example, specialist police units, but even these will systematically consult upon other disciplines, or they'll embed themselves, for example, within a mental health unit in the police to emphasize that they are working in a multidisciplinary way. And finally, case management. For all of these teams, threat assessment does not stop at the assessment stage nor the intervention stage. They all have some kind of structured way to monitor cases and progress. However, there are some important differences between them as well. The first being that the disciplines that are involved in the team or leading the team affect what resources are available. So if law enforcement has a key role in the team, this provides a lot of resources for information gathering in the assessment stage or protective measures in the intervention stage. But if it's mental health that's leading the team, then it's more likely you're going to have a lot of in-house interventions in the form of counseling. In terms of the assessment process, they all share the same approach where they're trying to triage and screen out the majority of cases that are low concern so that they can focus key resources and in-depth assessment on those that are higher risk. But within this, there's a lot of variation in the length of this process and how many steps are involved. The most extensive are the comprehensive school threat assessment guidelines, the CSTAG model in the US, the Salem-Kaiser model in schools in the US, and the Channel model in the UK for violent extremism. Regarding risk assessment tools, there's a lot of variation in what tools are available to these teams. So for some offense types, for example, stalking units, there's a wide range of quite well-regarded risk assessment tools that they can use. But for violent extremism, which is what we're mainly concerned with here, that doesn't exist because of the lacking evidence base and lacking validation of risk assessment tools. So a lot of these teams have to either create their own list of risk factors or use a toolbox of different instruments. In terms of interventions, there's a range of case ownership in these teams. A lot of them don't have ownership and they are merely consultative resources to other investigative teams. And that means that their main output is just recommendations. But even when the teams do have case ownership, sometimes these interventions aren't in-house, they're outsourced, and the main output of this team is to kind of create a network of agencies around the individual, and their main role is to facilitate access to these. Finally, and most importantly, there is a lack of evaluation. As Gina said again, this field is a mess. We don't know what works. There is broadly a lack of evaluation completely, and that really hinders any confidence in this being evidence-based or any way to compare between different models and their effectiveness. There are some exceptions to this, but it's the same players, generally the CSTAG model again and the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre in the UK. Another part of this project was to see what the US can learn from its allies abroad in terms of how threat assessment is implemented. couple of caveats there, that there is a lot more variation within the US than between the US and abroad. A lot of the variation is due to offense type or context and setting rather than region. And also the US is the leading voice here. As you saw, a lot of the literature is in the US. It was developed in the US, and a lot of the models outside the US do explicitly say that they're inspired by US models, the Secret Service model or some school violence models as well. Having said that, there are some unique features of non-US models that are worth noting. So in the structuring of multidisciplinary teams, this is often done a lot more deliberately outside the US. So for example, you might necessitate that a forensic nurse and a detective jointly process a case and sign it off, or you might have joint funding from two different departments to emphasize that it's multidisciplinary. For referrals, they often have dedicated referrals contacts for each referring agency to make sure that you're getting the right cases in. Some models, the Fixated Threat Assessment Center again, also proactively searches for threats on police databases and social media. And most importantly, there's a difference in framing away from threats outside the US. And this is reflected in the language used. So for example, in German schools, the language is of crisis and support. In the Channel program in the UK, it's about vulnerability. But also just the titles of these units. In the US, they're often called threat assessment teams. That's very rare outside the US. They'll be called something like the Problem Behavior Program. So what does this mean? For practice, this is being written up and hopefully published soon as some very useful but very ugly tables that compare between all of these categories and all of these models. And hopefully this can be used as a reference guide when practitioners are either developing a new team or considering their options to improve. For research, we really need threat assessment to be evidence-based, both in the risk factors that it's founded upon, but also the overall impacts of that threat assessment team as well. So we need research into risk factors and validating risk assessment tools, again, particularly for violent extremism, but we also need to be evaluating the effectiveness of these teams with regard to violence prevention, but also the outcomes for the individuals who are referred through. Brief note on limitations. All of this is not complete and exhaustive. By virtue of our very strict inclusion criteria, this is not by any means all threat assessment models that exist or all information on the ones that do. Thank you for listening. Before this is published, it is available as a kind of long-form directory on the NCITE website. If you just Google NCITE Threat Assessment Directory, it should take you there. Happy to take any questions in the Q&A.
Mic check. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Today I'm going to be talking about protecting events in under-resourced areas, but before I hop into that discussion, whoops, screen just vanished. Before I hop into that discussion, I just want to give a little plug for a project that we're just starting up related to behavioral threat assessment and management teams as well. Building a little bit off of the work that Amber and her team are doing, we're working with Ajmal Aziz and the Enter office in order to understand operationally what's required to not only operate these teams, but to sustain them. And there are often all different sorts of considerations that people need to have when trying to scale these teams and trying to support these teams in, again, sort of under-resourced areas where there isn't necessarily the infrastructure or the resources to fully staff a full threat assessment team, right? What kind of consultation models are available to people? How do people in these rural areas go and get some kind of information so that they can conduct their threat assessments? So we're starting that project up. We don't have any clear findings to share from that yet, but if anyone has any questions about that later after this talk, feel free to answer any questions there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about organized events and some of the issues that we run into when trying to secure these different events. I will say, so this project started a little bit because Dr. Erin Kearns and I are avid concert goers. Every single time we go to a concert, we walk out and we look at each other and we say something along the lines of, well, I'm sure the only thing that would protect me from a targeted violence attack would be probably luck, because the security apparatuses that we observe are not necessarily giving us any sort of peace as we're entering and leaving, and it's just kind of a cluster almost every single time. This gets even worse when you start thinking about festivals in comparison to stadiums, right? there are levels of hardness and levels of softness to each of these different critical infrastructures or different venues that people are hosting their events in. And so we need to be a little bit sensitive to the different ways that we are able to acquire and deploy resources to different areas that are hosting events and all of the critical considerations that come with, again, kind of managing some of those people and some of those resources. I'm sure many of you remember the 2017 Las Vegas shooting where a man opened fire from his 32nd floor hotel building on the Las Vegas Strip during a festival. A lot of security and law enforcement were on the grounds. No one was really prepared at that time to address any sort of high elevation shooters. And so with this event, it kind of sent waves throughout the event security world. People started to really reevaluate whether or not the security measures that they had in place were actually robust. Obviously, people were focusing on things like access control, things that people could manage via foot traffic, anything else, metal detectors. But when it comes to high elevation activity, there was no screening process, no sweeping of hotels or anything at that time. And so when this event happened, a lot of the event security folks that I'll talk about in this project here mentioned to us that this was a kind of a critical event for them that made them really reevaluate all of the different practices that they had in place. And one of the things that you'll hear, again, in this presentation here is what are the ways people are approaching this work? What are the tools that people are using? And what are the limitations to some of those tools? And how can we better guide people towards some sort of framework that enables them to best shore up their resources for each of the security functions that we do care about. After that 2017 Las Vegas shooting, obviously events are still a target for a lot of bad actors. We have the Moscow concert hall attack that I'm sure many of you have read about. Most recently, we also had a man who was indicted for plotting a mass shooting at a Bad Bunny concert here within the United States. So again, the threats to event venues continue to be of concern for people. We return to these event venues and we go to our concerts and we accept the risk that comes with it. Oftentimes, event security professionals do also, to an extent, accept a level of realistic risk for the work that they do. But what we hope to accomplish in a project like this is to really speak to all of those different functions that they need to fill and how they need to fill them. Before I hop into that, I want to talk just a little bit about some unique challenges to event security implementation. The first of which is that the structure of event security apparatuses are inherently interorganizational, right? You have law enforcement, you have private security, you have event planners. Depending on who you talk to, folks that are working concessions and other functions like ticketing are also a part of this event security apparatus. And usually they're also a mix of full-time, part-time, and also volunteer staff, which I think is a little bit unique for a lot of security functions. Bringing in people that aren't necessarily trained to do this and somehow getting them on the same page as all of these other people is a continual challenge. There's also membership inconsistency with a lot of event security apparatuses. Year over year, you aren't necessarily working with the same law enforcement personnel, you're not necessarily working with the same event planners. And so there are issues in membership consistency, and that kind of affects the extent that people are able to get on the same page in both the planning and implementation process for events. There are also budget limitations. I think most security professionals are no stranger to this, but there also requires a level of coordination in designing this kind of temporary footprint that people are trying to build, especially when it's a festival or some place where you're trying to set up outside and you're not confined within a building. You need to acquire the resources to create all of your perimeters. You need to figure out where people are going to be entering, when people are going to be exiting, and you need to be considering where people are going to be in specific times and specific places, and where to, again, kind of divvy up your resources so that you're covering all of your bases there. There are also very few opportunities within the performance of event security or the implementation of event security to stay sharp. So a lot of these people don't necessarily work together too frequently. They're coming together usually, a couple days before. Obviously, for a lot of big events, people are planning for months in advance, but when it comes to actually doing exercises, just to make sure that people are on the same page and understanding what their roles and responsibilities are, usually these shared team task experiences are few and far between. It's also really monotonous work or distracting work, depending on who you talk to. Event security professionals are just kind of standing around, observing, listening to the music. There's a lot of nothing sometimes, and you have to be alert somehow in the midst of all of that. And there are also very few success metrics, and I think this is something that many of us continue to struggle with within the prevention space, is that there isn't a lot that people can kind of anchor themselves in evaluating themselves on year over year. So when people are coming together for their after action, a big issue is that without any kind of clear security metrics for them to work with, other than maybe efficiency or what was maybe a headache to them when they were in the planning or implementation process, there isn't necessarily a lot to work with when people are trying to say, hey, what actually worked last year for security specifically? And so those pose continual issues for the implementation of event security. So what we wanted to do with this project, as we started scanning through all the available resources that people use to plan, was to develop this framework for what we like to call nimble event security. Oftentimes people are working, again, with these really limited resources. So what we wanted to advocate for is more of a functional approach to the work. Usually when people take a look at these guides, there's a laundry list of different measures that people can put in place. You see access control, you see locks, you see all the different personnel that should be involved. But what people sometimes forget is that there are very specific functions that need to be met for security. You want to deter attacks, you want to detect them anytime that there's something that's emerging, you want to delay them and defend against them whenever possible, right? So those are the main functions that we really care about. But when people are sifting through these laundry lists of guides or measures that they need to implement, a big issue is that you kind of forget that there are some functions that are actually kind of left completely open, that are completely unaddressed. And so if people take a little bit more of a functional approach to this work, what they get to do is think a little bit more intentionally about whether they're actually deterring threats, detecting them, delaying them, and defending against them. And again, in different times and different spaces. So there are a lot of attacks that happen either during an event, before an event, after an event. People really need to make sure that there's something in place, right, to actually deter, detect, delay, and defend at each of those different time points and at each of those different perimeters within their events. So being intentional about that is ever critical within this space. So when we set out to do this research, we were really interested in this kind of qualitative exploration of the work. What are the things that people struggle with? How do people plan for event security? And how do people manage and divvy up their resources within this work? So we conducted a bunch of interviews with event security professionals, and we're also in the process of distributing a survey that is basically a team task analysis, which means we're trying to figure out how people are distributing their people across different practices and across different tools that they're employing within their work. A few things that I'd like to highlight from this work from the planning side is that sometimes security is just kind of tacked on at the end. They're not necessarily there at the table from the start. And so when you start to just contract out your security functions and you don't necessarily have someone at the table, you're not necessarily acquiring all of the resources that you could possibly acquire for just physical infrastructure even for your event. So say, for instance, you're setting up a festival and you need to make sure that you have a variety of measures in place to create fencing or access control. If you don't have security there that's necessarily guiding that process, you're going to run into some issues. And so again, having security kind of at the start enables you to be better prepared for anything that arises. Institutional knowledge is also essential. There are tons and tons of folks that are able to contribute to this. So we have law enforcement that sometimes conduct threat assessments that are kind of ongoing in the lead up to an event. So in partnership with some of these other folks, having a little bit of budget reserved so that the growing threat assessment leading up to an event can actually inform the development of security is absolutely essential for a lot of these larger scale events. And having some things documented throughout the course of an event also enables year-over-year planning to be a little bit more efficient and effective. From a resource acquisition standpoint, there are a couple strategies that people have implemented to getting some buy-in for some of these security resources. One is to get people to appreciate the risk and basically scare people into saying, hey, if there's an attack, your reputation is going to be completely tarnished and you're not going to be able to host an event again. The other, which I found to be kind of interesting, is this security on a silver platter strategy, where you make it almost so easy for people to grasp what this event security apparatus is trying to accomplish, and you're able to just get buy-in through sheer credibility and through sheer ease of implementation. So people view your security plan and they're like, this is actually not a big problem and not going to be a big headache for me, so I'm just going to accept this anyway. It's kind of like, for the same reason, locking your door as a simple security measure is such an easy thing when you leave your house, right? It's just so easy, even though chances of a break-in are really, really low. And then for resource acquisition, one of the things that I thought was most interesting was people were really creative about the ways that they are able to acquire resources for different functions. So one of the folks that we spoke to said, look, you don't necessarily need fencing per se, but you need to have something there. You need to meet these functions somehow, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the traditional resources that you're using, right? So you don't necessarily need to have again, just the same access control measures as you would in a stadium, but maybe you need eyes for surveillance. Maybe you need, a bus, or maybe you need a decoy cop car, right, for deterrence functions like that. You don't necessarily need to, again, rely on traditional functions that would otherwise exist for your festival. And then finally, for the deployment of event security, context-based training is absolutely key. It's important that all these people are on the same page when they're doing this work, and oftentimes we find that there aren't enough opportunities for people to do that. So people are making time to fly out and do in-person trainings, they're trying to do tabletop exercises, they're trying to do whatever it is that they can, but again, time and resources are limited. And then another thing related to just the volunteer staff is that they're volunteers, right? And so there's a host of issues that come with engagement. And so people really need to feel empowered. They really need to feel like people are checking in on them and making sure that they're actually doing their jobs effectively. Because ultimately, people are the weakest link for a lot of these different security apparatuses. So with that said, I know I'm a little bit over time. There are a few recommendations here just related to some of the initial research findings that we have from this qualitative work. There's still a survey that we're hoping to put out in the near future, but the few things that I wanted to mention here are just that there are public-private partnerships and unconventional resources that people can use to just defend against any kind of threats that they're facing at their event venues. Having security from the start really facilitates that planning process and makes sure that everything runs smoothly, so that the event plan is centered on security and it's not just kind of an afterthought where the security apparatus is just kind of doing their own thing outside of all of the other event staff. And then creating a robust security plan based on previous documentation really helps in that process as well, and the deployment of resources strategically, again, kind of combining those people and those practices and those tools together in a way that enables you to meet all of those functions and make sure that there aren't any critical gaps there is also really critical. So with that said, I'll pass it off to Dr. Erin Kearns.
Mic check. It's funny that I can't turn a microphone on and I'm going to be talking about technology. There's a real irony in all of this. Hi, everyone. So it's super fun to be talking about this project because it's the first project that Joel Elson and I worked on when, actually, this started before we even officially started here at UNO. And it has just come to a conclusion, which is really helpful when you're trying to distill a giant project down into a couple of slides in 10 minutes that we've just written the closeout report for it. Awesome. So one of the things I think is really incredible about this project is that it embodies so many of the sort of the key values of NCITE. So the first is that this is responsive to stakeholder needs. The project that we're talking about, this was funded by a TVTP innovation grant, and the problem that we're addressing actually came to us about 3.5 years ago from Sarpy County, which is right south of here in Omaha, from their sheriff's department. And this was a county that has a really robust threat assessment management team. They've been in existence for 6 or 7 years at this point, and they really, they've got huge team, multidisciplinary, really they've got things figured out in terms of the actual management of cases. But one of the things that they were concerned about is that they recognize that they're not getting information from members of the public on all of the potential concerns that are existing within their communities. And they were wanting to sort of address what are ways that they could get more and better information from members of the public so that they could better do their jobs. So this was really very clearly responsive to something that they were concerned with. And this was, as I said, I was still working somewhere else. Joel hadn't started here 3.5 years ago. You're taking an innovation technology background for Joel, criminology for me. You've got the social science, the tech, very naturally interdisciplinary, someone who studies human-computer trust, someone who studies trust between communities and law enforcement, not really clear, obvious overlaps in what we do. And as we started talking with Captain Kevin Greiger in Sarpy County, Joel and I quickly realized that our fundamental research interests were really similar if you distill out the what are we talking about trust between. And this has been this very clear interdisciplinary project through and through, as you'll see as we continue talking about it. With the innovation, we thought about how can we help to get information from the public into the hands of this BTAM team in Sarpy County and all around the country. Joel's like, well, what if we developed a chatbot? And I was like, yeah, cool. What's a chatbot? Because this is, February of 2021, and there was no ChatGPT yet, and as you can see, I'm not super tech savvy. He describes what a chatbot is. I was like, oh, it's like the thing that I use to return stuff to Amazon. Awesome, yeah, we can totally do this. And in winning the grant and starting this project, it has been a huge lift with so much education and workforce development. I would try to name all of the students who've been involved in this project. There's a bunch of you back there. I see Isaac over here. Can you just raise your hand if you've worked on this project? Jack, Jack, why is your hand not raised? There's so many of you who have been involved in this project that it embodies so much of what the core of NCITE is. So we like our origin stories here as we use our Avenger references quite a bit, so I'll continue on from that. I could talk about any one of these for an hour, but I'm just going to quickly breeze through what the goal was and how we got to the point that this isn't just a go off and it's a tech thing or it's a social science thing. This is very, very clearly problems that my field has grappled with in how do you improve communication between law enforcement and the public or between any sort of entities and the public for decades. It's a problem that your field has dealt with for decades as well. The whole is so much greater than the sum of the parts here because of the steps that we took to get to this end product. So we wanted to develop an evidence-informed chatbot technology to improve TVTP tips reporting. To do that, in the first phase of this project, we had to understand what the gaps were and understand that we didn't know what all of these gaps might be. So part of this came from the collaboration with our law enforcement and community partners and the BTAM team that let us look at the de-identified tips that they have received to see what are some of the gaps here, what are some of the things that they are seeing variation that shouldn't be existing just in how things are classified and information that is missing to get a sense of what does this actually look like and where might there be some issues in terms of questions that are asked or not asked. We conducted focus groups, of course, with Sarpy County because they're the key partner, but also with behavioral threat assessment and management teams across the whole state of Nebraska and across the country, asking about these questions of where, how are you gathering information, sharing information currently? How does that work? How doesn't it work? What are some of the pain points? What are things you wish you had? We have to figure this out from the public too. We did conjoint experiments using the SAR indicators and what do people identify as being threatening or suspicious. Turns out the public's not very good at that. And then Joel and his team developed a prototype chatbot, and then we had people in the lab and using eye tracking to see where do people get stuck and hung up on these static web forms, which is just like any other survey you filled out online. And through all of that, using all of this information to develop a more robust chatbot. And then during this time, the thing that, of course, we couldn't possibly predict is that ChatGPT comes out. And if we wouldn't have then innovated, and I say we, it was Joel and his team, I didn't develop this part. Okay, well, we need to develop this and integrate the ChatGPT architecture, is that the term? Sure, into this, because if we don't, then we have an obsolete product that we're putting out at the end of this grant. That's not helpful. By developing this, looking at multiple different types of chat, so we didn't predict this, we had to sort of innovate here. Eventually having multiple different types of chatbots that were then deployed in a national survey experiment to see, are these actually gathering better information than other, oh, that's going way faster than I thought. Are these gathering more accurate information than static web forms? Because of course we don't want to deploy something that's not doing a better job than what already exists, and doing that with eye tracking as well. So the first finding is that static web forms, the thing that's the industry standard, these are overly complex. So this is the eye tracking, shows where people's eye movement, where their gaze duration is being fixed. And this is that some of the initial questions that are being asked on these forms that are used are just, they're complicated, is giving this like high level of cognitive burden off the bat. And I mean, people click out of surveys, they don't answer things that are, and these questions also are often things like, what type of offense are you trying to report? And I'll say this as a criminologist, I don't know that I could say exactly what the category of the offense is if I was trying to report something. So this needs to be more simplified, more interactive for members of the public who are lay people when trying to provide information. The second big piece of it, big finding, this is going to be no surprise to the two of you, is that there's a lack of resources, including better reporting systems, and this is a huge challenge for behavioral threat assessment and management teams, particularly those in rural areas. People in the public generally indicate that they have a willingness to want to help, but we're actually diving down into some of the questions about their knowledge about what are the things that are threatening, are potentially suspicious, are information that they should be providing to some official about something that should that somebody else needs to get help for. They just really don't have that good information, and they also don't have great information about where to provide, how to report, where to report. And then finally, looking at chatbots, and this is something that measuring people's awareness of attitudes towards and engagement with chatbots. This was something that was, I think, really important to add on to the study as well, is that with the advent of ChatGPT, understanding sort of where are people in the public in terms of their use of chatbots? How does ChatGPT change that? And what we found is that most Americans these days, the overwhelming majority, have used a chatbot in the last week. People tend to trust chatbots in general and want to use them in the future. In particular, the chatbots that we've developed, these are more engaging than the static web forms that are the industry standard for reporting. The information that was obtained from the chatbot technologies tended to be more accurate and less subjective than the industry standard web forms. and people viewed the chatbots as being just as, if not more, like they trusted them as much, and they viewed them as being just as, if not more, usable. So there are a lot of reports that are out from this project that can all be found here with this QR code. And it is really hard to distill down 3 years of projects and lots of data collection into 10 minutes. So yeah, that's where I am.
Thank you to our panel. Now begins the question-answer portion. Hold on, hiding a prize. Of this, and I want to start right off the bat with soon-to-be Dr. Seaward. I love that you compare and contrast with, what the U.S. does and what everyone else who's not the U.S. does. What opportunities, and I promise I'm not, pimping out the IAPS project here, but what opportunities are there for information sharing across countries in this regard?
Well, yes, IAPS. Hopefully research like what I'm doing with Paul and Zoe, providing a kind of bridge to understand between, like Erin said, a lot of these teams that exist in the US and elsewhere are very rural, they're very small scale, so it's difficult to get to information share even on a small scale, let alone internationally. So more research comparing and having an easy reference guide out there to see what's being done elsewhere. But it's hard to even say any lessons learnt that can be learnt from abroad when we don't know what's effective anyway. Because you can compare about what's being done elsewhere, but we don't know what works. And yeah, as I said, you guys are the leaders in the US at this. That may be because you have a disproportionate mass violence and gun control issue, and therefore a need for more threat assessment, but I'll let you make your own conclusions there. Yeah.
Thank you for that. On that point that you mentioned, I was thinking as everyone was talking that, when I was a reporter, Omaha is not immune to mass shootings. We had one. It was at our shopping mall at a very nice department store right before Christmas. 8 people were killed, 4 people were injured. The shooter died. And, there's not a day that goes by when I don't go into that department store and think about that event. And that happened in 2007, by the way. Now, I don't see armed guards. I don't see a big fat security presence. I don't know that I want to see that when I'm, shopping for a fashionable suit here. So this question goes to you, Tim. I was thinking about event security, and if, I'm going to Lollapalooza, do I really want the SWAT team at the entrance? How do you balance our lives, our freedom, our desire to do some fun activity, some normal activity, go to a grocery store, go to a shopping mall, go to a movie, and the security that we need? And so how do you do that up front as you're designing these events?
That's a great question, Erin. There are a couple different ways to do this. The first is just through architectural design. I know one of our soft target protection partners, Dr. Jenny Hesterman, often mentions the role of beautiful security. You don't necessarily need your bollards to be disgusting and deterring people from entering into your building just because they're hideous. But you can have things that are designed in a way that's kind of sleek, right? You can have bushes that are set up or foliage that's set up in front of your building so that people can't necessarily drive their car directly into your building, right? So there are ways from a physical security standpoint to design in a way that's not kind of gross and stale. And from a personnel standpoint, I think it really comes down to, sort of as Sam mentioned earlier, the role of culture within security. So you don't necessarily need, people wearing vests. You don't need armed guards all over the place all the time. You can sometimes just have some really security-minded folks that are able to detect, they understand what suspicious activities are. They're trained, for example, concession staff or ticketing staff that know exactly what is something that's of concern when they do see it. So there's a way to build security into the functionality of people that are doing other jobs. And obviously there are some limitations there, but I do think that it's a way to get people to feel like they're just walking in, and being served. I think, the big thing with events is that you attend for some kind of immersive experience, and, you don't want to be the person to worry about, security, and you don't even want to think about it necessarily. You just want to have a good time.
Right.
So anything that you can do to just really reduce that presence of armed guards in a way that's kind of sleek and built into people's jobs, I think makes it a little bit easier.
Doesn't 10 just make you feel so good? Like, talk about a calming presence. Next time I go to Von Maur, I'm taking you 10, or any movie, or any public gathering. I want to remind the audience, we have Ryan, wave Ryan, he's got a microphone, we have Camden, so if you do have questions, please raise your hand, they'll get to you, and online audience, I invite you to send your questions as well. Yeah, we'll go with our board member, Ruhana, thank you.
Hi, thanks, Erin, for this opportunity. Good morning, everyone. Great panel. The question is primarily because of something Sam said, but anyone studying organizational culture and leadership, please feel free to jump in. Not so much a question, but maybe a plea for further research. Okay. So OPM, Office of Personnel Management, that is the HR clearinghouse for the entire federal government serving over 3 million folks, right? They do a detailed climate survey every year that I fill out. There's the Intelligence Community Climate Survey that I fill out. Then there's the Office of Director of National Intelligence, ODNI Climate Survey that I fill out. Trying to set the context here. So the last slide that Sam presented, the 8 levers of leadership and building culture. So that's not a surprise to anybody who studies leadership development, top management, culture, performance, etc. So I read enough Harvard Business School review articles to anyone who's interested to know these are check boxes. These are the things we do. What I'm asking for, what I'm missing, is a sense of prioritization. That's number one. Number two, I know I should do all of these things, but I can't get to all of those things. If there are 3 things I can do to truly motivate people in the IC, specifically in the counterterrorism domain, well, money is not flush. What are the 3 things that I need to prioritize? We don't have, at least I have not seen enough research in this community that will help me make that determination. If I have $200,000 to give out this year, am I focusing on awards and recognition? Am I focusing on training and development? Am I sending them somewhere? What am I doing with that money? We grapple with that every single day because we have to make hard decisions. The other thing I did not see on the slide, and maybe I missed it, is alignment to mission. Because every single time we send out these climate surveys and we get them back, people say all sorts of things, the people who actually respond to the surveys anymore. The number one thing they say is, leadership is broken, such and such is broken, but I'm here for the mission. So what does that incentive, that motivation, that alignment to mission truly impact those leadership factors? I don't know if our favorite terrorism groups can hand out money or training opportunities. Actually, training opportunities are good for them. I know they spend money on that. But jokes aside, I don't have a clear picture of what the true levers in what priority are to impact my culture. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you. That was an awesome question/plea. And Sam, I'm wondering if you can take that, and I want you to add this. I don't know if you're asking this, but I kind of heard it from the ground up. If people complain leadership is broken, so you can't control that, what can maybe from the ground up do in this regard?
Yeah. Great question. We could talk about IO stuff all day. This is fun. This is in my wheelhouse. So there is some literature to help both identify the underlying factors. So Larry James has done a bunch of work on climate and culture, identifying 4 or 5 actually core factors, and I touched on a few of those. And he has done a number of surveys that give us some indication of prioritization. So I can pass along some of that literature as well as some of the things that I've done as well. There was a hint of some prioritization on the slides, which is at least the top one. The biggest impact from a culture standpoint is that direct supervisor that you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis. Top management support is great, and without it, it's very difficult to have good first-line supervisors. But for most folks in an organization, the person that they're interacting with on a day-to-day basis is going to carry the greatest weight with them. So your supervisor, if they're encouraging and supporting the kinds of goals that are necessary for that organization, that will have the biggest impact. And then the second one, historically, has been around performance management and performance appraisal. So if we're telling folks that we care about something, but we're not tying that to anything that is related to their promotion or their incentive structure, eventually that stuff just starts to go away. The rest of the things are all important, but from a lever standpoint, I would grab those two first. I think your comment about alignment with vision and mission is a very good one and critical, and I was a little rushed at the end because I didn't give myself enough time, but the top management support, we would have touched on that at least a little bit, which is, it's nice to have a first-line supervisor that is telling us all the things that we need to have, but if the folks above them are not in line with the folks that we're interacting with on a more first-line basis, that lack of alignment with mission means that it's not sustainable, and folks tend to leave and attrit out of the organization over time. So would have touched on it, but I think directly stating it is an important gap there. What was the last thing you wanted to say?
Well, this just may be a me question, not a you question, so sorry. But sometimes you're a mission-driven person, you're in this job, you want to be in this job.
Top-down stuff. Yeah, peers matter too, so I touched on it a little bit with bad apples and rising stars, but if you have folks that are really good around you, so not only your first-line supervisor, but we all work with great people next to us, and we know that makes our job awesome, and we listen to them, and we do that at NCITE. Our job is great because of the people that are next to us, right? Erin is right next.
Exactly. By the way, we sit next to each other.
So yeah, absolutely, and my students know this because I talk about this all the time, but I have high expectations for them to set the culture in the organization. So I expect them to influence their peers, and I'm talking to them about that, and they've taken that on. They're here and working hard and all those things. So absolutely, you can have more of a bottom-up if folks are committed to it, yeah.
Great. We have another question from, hi Barbie, in the audience. Hi Barbie.
Hi, Abby Smith, Office of Intelligence and Analysis at DHS. I was kind of wondering, this is for Tin again, coming off of Erin's original question. We know that, yes, mass casualty events happen at these kind of like pop-up events like concerts and festivals and things like that. Have there been any considerations like in your research looking at how some of these same security services or techniques could be applied to the places that we most frequently see mass casualty attacks, places like grocery stores, malls, things of that nature that are kind of long-standing, that can implement sort of a long-standing security posture instead of having this pop-up posture. But maybe there was a fly, but maybe some of the same like security considerations.
Yeah, I think a lot of the same principles apply. I think the thing that's maybe most unique to events is that, again, you're sort of planning for a specific time in a specific place. So you're a little bit limited in the scope of your work. But to your point, when it's a standing structure, there are certainly other things that folks can rely on that don't necessarily involve the use of people. So for example, oftentimes people will just have decoy cameras, or they'll just have someone wearing a vest standing in front of their grocery store. So there are some kind of slight measures that people can take to protect some of those venues. But I think it really, again, comes down to an understanding of what that threat landscape is in your local area. Oftentimes, having conversations with law enforcement really, really helps with that. And then the other is just aligning all of those different security functions with all those different practices and tools. So I know a common theme across a lot of these presentations in the last couple days has been the tools that are given to people aren't necessarily useful unless they know how to use them, right, effectively. So just making sure that if there is a reporting system that people are using, that they're well trained on that, right? If there are approach behaviors that people should be looking out for, they need to be trained on that. And again, I think it requires all hands training if possible for all the folks that are involved, because ultimately, you can't really have too many security personnel staffed at your local grocery store. So you're going to need some other people that are trained on some of that stuff too, whether it's managers or whether it's frontline staff.
Thank you. We got another question?
Appreciate it. Kevin Peters again, DHS INA. Two questions, one hopefully quick for Tin to follow up on the last question, then one for Erin and Joel. In terms of the events that we're talking about in your research, and I think I heard in the response to the last question, those are all around generally fixed locations. A lot of the other concerns we continue to have are around more dynamic parades. And in major urban areas where we have celebrations of the Celtics or championships, world-class police departments, lots of resources, but what about how could we apply your research to smaller communities? And I think really the concern is recently Chad and his team put out a jib about threats to pride events, parades, those things. Obviously in large major areas, they have lots of resources, but what about more smaller rural areas? How could we apply your research to events like that? And I have a follow-up question for Erin and Joel as well.
Yeah, thanks for this. Whoops. Thanks for that question. It's a really good one and actually forecasts some of the work that we're going to be doing in the next year, following some multi-jurisdictional, multi-day events, one of which is moving. So one of the things that I think really benefits folks is just really understanding their vulnerabilities well, especially for some of those moving events. For example, obviously we had the Highland Park parade shooting. That's another high elevation shooter vulnerability that people weren't considering. So helping people figure out exactly what their vulnerabilities are and what areas or vantage points we need to restrict access to that are maybe outside the immediate perimeter of the event is really essential. And sometimes that requires building partnerships with all of the different local businesses that are around the area. One of the folks that we spoke to as part of our project for this previous year mentioned that he struggled to do he struggled to complete a comprehensive vulnerability assessment in part because he didn't have the relationships necessary to, get on the roofs of buildings, which in some cases maybe is a good thing. But in others, you just don't necessarily know what happens when someone actually finds access there some way. So having, again, some of those private-public partnerships is really essential for some of those under-resourced areas because, you're small communities. So being tight-knit really improves your security posture because you know exactly who to talk to, and if you have any small concerns and you're doing your vulnerability assessment, then some of those people can actually support you in that process.
Great, thank you. And happy to take this offline with Erin and Joel, but I've had the benefit of, for years, talking to you about this project. And with the integration of ChatGPT into the bots, one of the big things for the NSI that we remain very concerned that we always want to talk about when SAR is being analyzed and reviewed is the throwing away things that could be violating people's civil rights, civil liberties, and their privacy. With LLMs and other kinds of tools that are using AI in ways to integrate things, can you talk maybe a little bit about how, currently that's done by humans, looking against whether it's the functional standards in the NSI or other kinds of review. A human in the loop has to be there to ensure that this is not being used to target a group, a person, potentially violate their privacy or civil rights. Can you talk about how the technology is working to help, or how does that integrate with the review of whether it's actual functional standard SAR or whatever we're talking about in terms of tips and leads coming in through this process?
There we go, mic's on again. That's a technical Joel question. Probably, or we can maybe offline, I'm not sure what's better.
Erin, stay there on the mic. Keep your mic on. I have a question for you. And if you guys want to just connect offline, is that what we've decided? So Joel can answer that. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Melissa. Sorry.
Great panel. Thank you guys so much. Melissa Zisler from the DHS Enter Program Office. I had a couple quick questions. I know we're probably short on time. But for Amber, I was wondering, you mentioned kind of the non-US folks that do the proactive searches, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and how they do that, and if they do have to take those privacy, civil rights, civil liberties into account when doing that, because that's quite different than a lot of how we operate here in the U.S. And then for Tin, I was wondering, in terms of taking that human element into account, what Sam was talking about and how important that is with security, with the training aspect for some of these events, what is there a standard that folks do for training on these types of events, or recommendation that you have as far as like what would be a good training gold standard? And are they training for like suspicious activity, and what does that look like?
So I'll take that one first. I don't know a huge amount of the details of this, but I'll talk about what I do know. So the unit that I was talking about that uses proactive searches is the Fixated Threat Assessment Centre in the UK that deals with threats to public figures, primarily the British royal family and politicians. And they have a system for proactive searches on police databases and an emerging strategy for social media. They are the UK's first joint health and police unit, and they're officially based in the police. So the beauty of that is that they've got access to all of the police database systems that they can search. In terms of the difficulties of data sharing in this multidisciplinary environment, a lot of what I found when doing the systematic review is there are obvious problems with sharing health data with police, that direction, but the way that they get around this most of the time is they share the other direction. So they'll share police and intelligence information with forensic psychiatrists so that they know the context and the severity of the threats that that individual's making, for example. So that seems to be the way they get around it. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know too much more detail on that.
And to answer your question about training for some of these event security folks, I think having some kind of training for suspicious activity is obviously really important. Understanding the behavior side of things is probably the most important. I think anyone who has worked in threat assessment knows that you don't want to just identify a person based on any surface level characteristics. You want to see things that are happening that are of concern. So training people to recognize what those signs are really, really useful. One of our local folks mentioned the importance of this just bomb surveillance training that he took through CISA, I think. And it actually allowed him to recognize signs of suspicious activity that they ended up catching someone before they caused any sort of harm at their event, which I thought was a pretty neat example. The other thing is that that's an individual level capability. We also need to have some kind of translation of that information to the group level or the unit level. And so people need to be also well trained on just what are all the roles and responsibilities on that team, which differs depending on who you talk to. So as long as those roles are clear and where information flow should be going is clear, having a good understanding of those suspicious activities and things to look out for are absolutely essential. So I mentioned the importance of those shared team task experiences. Really, it is just practicing and making sure you're comfortable with sharing that information when you do need to share it.
Okay, I think we're going to cut to break right now. Thank you so much for this panel.